This video is a review of the AP synthesis essay. So you might be looking at this for the first time, or you might be coming back to this to kind of get a refresher before we work on a synthesis essay. I'm going to try to go through this pretty quick to give you a couple of reminders and then kind of give you some of my expectations of what I'm going to be looking for when you do your synthesis essay. Um, First, I want to go over a couple things that we already talked about in class. The first thing would be I want you to think back to some of the lessons that we did. All of these lessons I'm about to reference, there are videos for on our website. So make sure if there's a part of this that you're not sure about, a good thing to do would be to go back and watch some of these videos and make sure you have them down. First thing I want you to remember that we did is we had a lesson on elevated language, and I want you to remember that one of the things we're looking for is that you think about who your audience is when you're writing this essay. Your synthesis essay audience are AP graders, and those graders are college professors and other AP English teachers. They're looking for a tone and for language that is elevated. At the very least, it sounds serious and academic. It's not a time to be playful, anything like that. You're supposed to have serious sounding language. Also, you should remember our lesson on thesis statements. You've gotten a little bit of feedback on thesis statements. You need to, first of all, make sure you have a thesis statement. Make sure it's structured correctly. And remember that without that thesis statement, it's going to be really hard to write a good essay. The first thing that I'm going to look for when I grade this is a thesis statement. In case you don't remember, here's a good example of a well-written thesis statement. This particular thesis statement has 3 reasons attached to it. I'm looking for probably 2 to 3 reasons on your thesis statement as well for the synthesis essay. Remember that on a thesis statement, clearly using the language of the prompt, state what position you're taking. Incentives for charities are unethical, for instance. Have a transition word like because, and then list the reasons that you're going to prove in your essay. Also, recall that a big part of what we're doing is providing evidence for our arguments. So you're going to make this thesis statement, you're going to have these reasons, and then most of your writing is going to be finding this evidence in the synthesis essay from the sources that are provided and building that evidence, explaining that evidence in a way that proves your case to your audience. That's what you're attempting to do. The biggest problem my students run into when you try to do this is that you don't do a good job of explaining your evidence. So make sure when you use those sources on that synthesis essay, when you quote those sources, that you don't just assume that it makes sense to your audience. You need to build up to that evidence. Then you need to give the evidence. Then you need to explain the evidence. Remember what happens when you assume, right? It's not a good thing. Just a visual reminder of what I'm talking about. Remember, we looked at examples of a paragraph that used evidence in a weak way that only had one sentence before and one sentence after the quote from the source. And then we looked at evidence that was integrated into your paragraph with much more strength. And you can look on here, there's several sentences leading up that builds up to giving your evidence, and then there's several sentences afterwards explaining and hitting your point home to your audience. We are looking for that kind of paragraph here, and you should have multiple paragraphs, every piece of evidence, every source you use. And remember, you have to use 3 to 4 sources on this essay. Every single one of those should be well explained like this. Remember that when you do quote sentences from these sources, you need to quote them the proper way. If you remember our using quotations lesson, what I'm looking for is an introductory phrase, a comma if it's appropriate. In this case, there was no comma because there didn't need to be. A quotation mark at the beginning and end, and then the source citation with the period outside of the quotation mark and outside of the citation as well. Okay, really quickly, I want to give you an idea about what these synthesis AP essay prompts look like. So if you take a look at this example here, on one page it'll have this kind of information. This is actually from a 2011 AP test. It's usually the first question is a synthesis essay, and it'll give you the suggested time and tell you how much it scored. And then all of this information on here, all of this information is very important. You need to make sure you read the entire thing because usually they don't really tell you what the prompt is or what you're supposed to be writing about until you get down to the bottom. So it depends. You need to read the entire thing and make sure you're clear on what question you're asking. They'll also list the sources like this, and they do this so that you can, however you want to do the internal citation. If you want to do the author's last name, they list it there for you. If you'd rather just write source A, B, C, D, E, F, you're welcome to do that as well. But that's what a prompt page looks like, and you need to make sure you read all of that. Then you get to your sources. All the sources have a box like this at the top that tells you the author's name, tells you the title, tells you where it came from, and the date that it was written. And it will also tell you what source it's being labeled as. So if you use something from this source, it would be source A. If you notice on all of these, some of them are paragraphs like this. There's the box with information. Usually it'll have italicized here a sentence that tells you a little more information about it. And the idea is that you read through these sources and you find the information or quotes that will work to prove the argument you're trying to make. So maybe you read through here and you find a sentence that you like particularly and you're going to quote in that essay. Usually there are about 6 of these sources, and all of the sources, there will be some that are kind of in between on the issue that you're arguing. There will be some that are clearly promoting one side and some that are clearly promoting the other, and you need to be able to weed through these sources and pick out the evidence and the quotes that are going to work for you. Um, you just need to make sure that you use 3 different sources. That means you have to use at least 3 different sources. For instance, you can use 2 quotes from source E, but that only counts as using 1 source. You need to use 3 of the different sources in your essay. You can have as many quotes as you want from each source, but there has to be at least 3 different sources used. Okay, and they usually say don't do any more than 4 different sources, or else your writing starts sounding a little crazy. If you notice, some of these sources, like this one, are more of a graphic source. So obviously, you usually can't directly quote a graphic, so you have to paraphrase the graphic, but you still cite it the same way. Here's an example of the last source. Okay, sometimes the points are bulleted, things like that. The idea is that you would use 3 to 4 of these sources in each one of those that you pick, 3 to 4 that you pick. You'd pick out some certain sentences or pieces of evidence from there that you would want to use to prove your point. Let me also talk about the scoring of these essays. The way they're going to score each essay is on a scale of 9 being the highest. Really, if you get an 8 or 9, you're talking that's a very, very, very good piece of writing, to all the way down to a 1 as a possible score, or a 0, or even you can get a dash here. And a dash means that that you kind of missed the point completely. Hopefully, we don't have too many of those. And there's every score possible in between. You can see they say little success is a 2. Usually students fall between a 4 and a 5 on their essays. And remember, we're shooting for an average score of 5 on these. If we can average a score of 5 on each of the 3 essays, and you can get half the multiple choice right, you're still in a position to pass that AP test. I will tell you right now, it is very, very hard to get to that 6, 7, 8, particularly to that 9 score. Okay, so don't have your expectations set on being able to do that right away. We're going to work up to that. For now, let's shoot at scoring a 5. Okay, I wanted to show you also a couple of student samples of synthesis essays. These are actually samples from students on the AP test. I want to show you what they look like. First of all, this one here scored an 8, which is really impressive, right? That's one of those scores that's hard to get. And I want you to notice, first of all, that it's not perfect. There are mistakes, there's things scratched out, there's things changed. That's one of the things you need to know. Just because something is neat doesn't mean it's good, and just because it's messy doesn't mean it's bad. I know some of you have had teachers in the past that say if it's not perfect, you should crumble it up and throw it away. Well, that's not true on the AP test. They understand that this is a rough draft and they're grading it as a rough draft. If obviously someone can scratch stuff out and still get an 8, then so can you. But go ahead and take a second and look at this. If you notice that this author writes has a great introduction talking about a small college town, everything like that. You can pause it and read it if you want. But then they also get down here, and at the end of their first paragraph, they have essentially a thesis statement. Okay, it's a little different than the ones we've worked on, but we're going to do ours our way first and work up to something like this. But as they continue your paper, you notice they build up to their facts and information. Okay, they use different sources. They take a lot of time to explain those sources. Okay, here's the continuation. Notice they're on their second page here. They do a lot of explaining, and that's what I'm looking for from you guys. When you're using this information, you have to take the time to explain it. Notice here, there's more facts and information. There's your source citation in there, and more explaining. Notice we go to a third page here. Okay, so they had about 2.5 pages on a college ruled paper. That's about 3 pages on the paper I'm giving you for your timed writings today. And notice that will be a little bit of a difference there, but you need to write quite a bit to do well on this. I mean, you notice this student, that's a lot of writing. Okay, if you look down here, as we continue kind of looking along here, here's a student who got a 6, a score of 6. Again, this is about the score that we're shooting for. Once again, notice, not perfect. It doesn't have to be pretty. It has to be good. Work it, rework it. This student did a really good job introducing it and having a good thesis statement. And as they continue on, I want you to notice the amount of writing. 3 pages, not perfect, but 3 pages. They chose to do the author's last name in the citation. That's allowed. Okay. 4 pages, not perfect, but a lot of good explaining. Taking the time when they give evidence to connect it to their point. And on all the way to a 5th page. So, if you get a score of 5 or 6, that will be an A in the grade book in my class. Okay, so we're shooting for a score of 5 or 6 to begin with, and then anything above that is just great. It's wonderful, but that's what you're shooting for in here. This next one is an example of an essay that scored much lower. I think this one scored a 2 or a 3. So this is what we don't want. Notice, not very elevated language, sounds too casual, doesn't really take a stand and have a good thesis statement. They did put their sources in there, but they don't explain the sources. Look, here's a quote that just begins with a quotation mark, no introduction. Ends without any explanation. This is not good. That's what I don't want to see. That's why we've been talking about that. And notice it's not very long either. That's it. It's 2.25 pages. So notice if you have any less than 3 pages, you're in the danger zone unless you just did an awesome piece of writing like that first one. So keep that in mind. Just so you have an idea about what you should do when you actually do the timed writing, I've broken that down for you here. There's a handout on the website that has this information in more detail, but I'm going to go over it really quickly so you know what I'm talking about. Before you start doing that timed writing, before you start writing that synthesis essay, there's some things that you should do first. And the first thing you should always do is read all of the first page of the prompt. That page that tells you what you're writing about, you need to read all of it in detail. The next thing you need to do is to pick a side that you're going to argue. decide what is it that you're going to say. What position are you going to take here? You need to decide that before you start reading the sources, because if you take the time while you're reading the sources to be picking out what side you want to write on in your head, it ends up wasting a lot of time that you don't have. You have 40 minutes to complete this writing, so you don't have a lot of time to be wavering back and forth trying to decide what side you're going to take. The next thing you should do before you write is after you pick a side, read the attached sources. Choose the specific evidence you will quote, and you can also paraphrase it in your argument. That means what you should do when you're planning is, as you're reading through those sources, you need to be underlining the evidence that you're going to use. You don't have enough time to sit and think about it and really mull over it. You have to, as you're reading, decide, yes, this is a good sentence for me to use. I'm underlining it. That means I'm going to use this one. You must use between 3 and 4 of the attached sources. Okay. In addition to those 3 to 4 sources, you can also use personal experience as evidence, but that personal experience does not count as one of those 3 to 4 sources. In order to get an A on this assignment, you have to have quotes from 3 to 4 of the sources. Finally, when you've done all that, make sure you have, before you start writing, a thesis statement that clearly states your position, uses a transition word like because, and lists the reason or reasons that your evidence will prove. You need to have all that done before you start writing. If you take the time to write a good thesis statement, to have a good plan, and to pick out good pieces of evidence, it will show when you start actually writing that essay and putting pen to paper. It will be so much easier. You won't get stuck, you won't get lost, and you'll know where you're going. So that was before you write. While you write, there's some things you should remember. There's some reminders that you should have. Starting with, make sure you use paragraphs. Some students just blank out and forget that they need paragraphs. Paragraphs aren't a big deal. Sometimes people tell you they have to be a certain amount of sentences long or anything like that, but that's really not true. Paragraphs can be whatever you want them to be. They're just a way to visually organize information for your readers. So as long as you're organizing paragraphs and deciding where to put your paragraph breaks, and you have a reason and it makes sense to you and it will help your audience understand how your essay is organized, that's your only concern with paragraphs. The other thing is, make sure to correctly introduce, punctuate, and internally cite each quote you use as evidence. That will be something I'm looking for in your grade. Don't assume. Take the time to explain your thinking, reasons, and evidence. This is the one that traps a lot of people. If you get all the technical stuff right, that's the first step. The second step is really explaining things. Also, make sure everything you write builds on the statement you made in your thesis. If it doesn't, leave it out or add it to your thesis. And finally, make sure that you're using language that is appropriate for a serious academic audience. You don't want to be friendly with the audience. You want them to trust you as an expert. You want them to be impressed with your language skills. That's the goal of the synthesis essay. And last but not least, I want to give you an idea of a really basic structure for the synthesis essay. This is by no means the only way to write the synthesis essay, but I want you to have an idea of what I'm looking for. So the basic structure would include things like an opening paragraph with maybe 1 to 3 introductory sentences that ease your reader into the topic of your paper, and then ending that opening paragraph with one clearly worded thesis statement with a transition word and reasons. 1 sentence if possible, 2 at most, for that thesis statement. Then from there you would move into the body of your essay, and that body should have multiple paragraphs, and each of those paragraphs should have certain things. This is certainly a way to organize those paragraphs. Have a topic sentence that focuses the reader on the first reason or first point you're going to make. Then have 2 to 3 sentences that build up to the evidence that you're going to give, to that quote from that source. How are you going to prepare your reader for that? You want them to know what they're getting into when they get to that quote or paraphrase. Then you want to actually give the quote, right? Introductory phrase, correct punctuation, quote the evidence from your source, including the citation in parentheses at the end. Then to close out that section, you want to have 2 to 3 sentences that explain what the reader should have taken away from the evidence you just gave. How does it connect to your thesis or original argument, right? You want to make sure you do that and repeat that paragraph, repeat that style of giving evidence and explaining it throughout your paper. One piece of evidence is not enough. Obviously, if you have to use 3 to 4 sources, you need at least 3 to 4 pieces of evidence. That means at least 3 body paragraphs. But the more evidence, the better, right? There's no such thing as too much evidence. Finally, you want to have some sort of closing. This is always hard to describe, but you're looking for 2 to 3 sentences at the end of your writing that help hit home the argument that you're making in your thesis. If you can do these things, you will have done a great job on your synthesis essay. So that's what we're looking for, and I hope this little talk was helpful. And if you have any questions, make sure to talk to me, email me, hit up our Twitter account, do whatever you need to do to get this cleared up before we write our synthesis essay. All right.